on land, at sea, in the air, and even in outer space. This is the All Our Yesterdays podcast, brought to you by Persistence of Vision Publishing. I'm LB Dio.
And I'm Lance Peaver Myers.
And I'm William Gold.
Yay! Who's this other guy?
Well,
it's usually just us three. What's going on here?
thanks for asking, Lance. This is Professor Devin Stauffer, a professor of political philosophy in the government department at the University of Texas at Austin.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Now, Professor, I hope you don't expect us to know our stuff.
As long as you don't expect me to know my stuff.
Wait. Well, you're our very first guest on the show, so we're extremely delighted to have you. We intend to make our feelings of gratitude to you known in various ways that we can discuss later. And folks, you should also know that we're so happy to have the professor here that we are going to be doing a special topic that's a little out of the sequence of the other shows we've done. So far, we've done the first 13 billion years of the universe, with the Big Bang, and then going up through about 1000 BCE. So, yeah, roughly what, 3,000 years ago is where we left off. And we're going to fast forward about 500-600 years to classical Greece. And the reason we're going to do that is because the professor has an expertise in Thucydides. Now, who here knows who Thucydides is?
All the hands lowered.
All hands are lowered. Okay.
Except Devin's.
Devin, well, even Devin's hand is lowered. No. So I'll tell you. Thucydides was a Athenian general who was an actual participant in the Peloponnesian War. He was also, however, one of the first two historians of all time. Have I got that right?
Yeah, so Herodotus is the other one you have in mind. Yeah, so Herodotus preceded him, and his narrative picks up sort of where Herodotus leaves off.
Yes.
Herodotus' history ends with the Persian invasion of Greece. And then Thucydides picks up more. That's a little more complicated at the beginning of the book, but you think rough way to think about it, Thucydides picks up where Herodotus leaves off.
Yes,
and Herodotus did discuss the invasion of Greece.
He did, yes. So Herodotus' book is about many different things, but it ends with a narrative of the Persian invasion of Greece.
And that's where we get films like the Troy.
The 300.
The 300.
Yeah, the 300. Yeah. So.
That's right, and that's important to remember as we proceed. But it's also probably worth mentioning very briefly to the audience what the heck the Peloponnesian War was.
Yeah, so the Peloponnesian War was a 27-year war between, it's thought of as between Athens and Sparta, but it was really an alliance on each side, more of an alliance on the Spartan side, so that you could say the Spartan alliance over and against Athens, which by that time, and we may get into this, was part of the reason for the war. Athens had become an empire between the Persian War, or wars. Sometimes it's called war, sometimes it's war, since it was multiple invasions that the Greeks beat back. But so in the interim between the end of the Persian Wars and the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, Athens had grown into an imperial power. And part of the main reason, in fact, for the Peloponnesian War was the fear of the other Greek city-states at Athens's dominance and ever-increasing dominance. So Athens had become an imperial power, and Sparta was the center of the resistance to that, and the city to which the other cities turned to lead the anti-Athenian alliance. So it was an alliance of city-states against Athens. Now, Athens had a few allies of its own, and then it had its allies sort of in quotation marks, which were the cities that had started as allies of Athens, but had become kind of quasi-subjects over time. So it was a broad war that engulfed all of Greece, and it came at the height of Greek civilization, and it's at least one of the main causes why Greek civilization declined from its great peak. So you can think of it as occurring right at the peak of Greek civilization. And it was so destructive, especially for Athens, that it's one of the reasons why Athens declined. And since Athens was the real centerpiece of what we think of as Greek civilization, it's one of the reasons why that began to wane. It didn't just fall apart, but it was the beginning of the end of Greek civilization.
So what is the name? Where do we get
Peloponnesian
Yes.
War? So Peloponnese is the peninsula that Sparta is on. So in Greece there's a Peloponnesian peninsula, and so I suppose I actually don't know why they named the war after that peninsula. I suppose it was because that was the locus of the resistance to Athens. I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably Athens
Yeah.
named the war, and they weren't going to name it the Athenian.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But it's interesting. You talked a little bit about Athens as a centerpiece of the Greek society, and as we think of it, Thucydides was different from Herodotus and took pains to differentiate himself from Herodotus in that he was much more objective and fact based.
Yeah.
That's what he aspired to do,
Yeah.
at least, was to be that way. And yet, when we talk about his descriptions of the history of Greece, he is obliged to go into some pretty mythical territory.
Yeah, early on. So I think you're right. So there's one thing about Thucydides' book is it's almost entirely about the war, but it starts with I don't know how many pages, 25 page section on the whole early history of Greece. This chunk of the book is called the archaeology, Thucydides' archaeology. And he kind of goes back there to the very origins of Greek civilization and tells the story of the rise of Greece as a civilization, so teeing up. And you're right, he presents himself there, you could say, as the first real realist. And in some ways, he's still thought of as the father of international relations realism. And he sets himself apart from Herodotus in that regard, and especially from Homer. So he says, I'm not going to embellish things like and so if you look at, and one thing he means by that is in Thucydides' account, you don't have gods running around doing things the way you do in Homer's epics. So and that's part of what he has in mind. So although since it was a deeply religious society, religion factors in, but Thucydides himself seems to have a critical distance on that.
Yeah.
And he does go back and tell the story, but even in his telling of the early stories, he strips out some of the mythical stuff. So just to give an example, one of the great early Greek founders, you could say, lawgivers, was Minos, who established the Cretan law code. And according to tradition, he got the Cretan law code through a revelation from Zeus in a cave. Thucydides just leaves that out. And he presents Minos as a kind of as the first person who cleared the seas of pirates and that therefore made a kind of civilized life possible. But he presents him as kind of the pirate who beat all the other pirates.
Yes.
So in other words, he wasn't doing it because Zeus urged him to do it or for any kind of high-minded reason. He wanted control of the seas himself. So he was sort of like the first pirate who got a monopoly on piracy. And just a little interesting textual detail, Thucydides, this is the way he sort of sketches it. He indicates that early on, there was no moral bad odor on piracy. So people would show up and they'd say, "Are you pirates?" You wouldn't. It wasn't considered. It was just the way. It was part of the way people lived. But after Minos, it came to be seen as wrongdoing. And he says he puts it with Minos. He says he expelled the wrongdoers. And I think it's Thucydides' way of sketching a little bit of account of how moral notions and notions of justice begin to emerge in the world. And in this respect, you could say he's giving a kind of realist account. It was through the power-seeking actions of figures like Minos that notions of right and wrong and morality began to emerge into the Greek world.
Right.
So
Morality becomes a tool at the service of power.
Yeah, but then the way Thucydides presents it, but once it takes root, it then becomes very important.
Mhm.
And so the question of justice and the justice of the war is a really central question to Thucydides' narrative, and he presents different views of that. Some of them are quite what you call quote unquote realist views, and some of them are not. And one of the features of this war is that it's it's a struggle between two great cities that are very, you could say, morally different. Sparta's old-fashioned, law-abiding, traditionalist, more pious. And Athens, at least a segment of Athens, is more radical, progressive in the ancient meaning of those terms, more skeptical, more realist. And so part of the story is about the conflict between those two outlooks. And so Thucydides is constantly looking through different lenses at the Athens-Sparta divide.
What you were saying is radical is, or what was considered radical is a realist perspective at this time.
Yeah, so for instance, and I had two things above all in mind on that. That at least the Athenian elite, this was less true of the Athenian demos of the people, but at least the Athenian elite, some of them were quite skeptical about the gods. Not all of them, but some. There was religious skepticism much more prevalent in Athens than in Sparta. And then they give you could say, a morally radical defense of their empire in a very famous speech that they give at Sparta, where they defend their empire. You could say they excuse their empire by making a famous argument that sometimes summarized as the argument that might makes right. But it's not exactly that. Their argument is that they were compelled by their desire, by fear, honor, and interest to develop their empire, and that those things act as compulsions on human beings, and therefore that they're not to blame for building their empire. So they make this, and that argument, which they make there, and they make it also in this thing called the Melian dialogue, which we may come to that later, this moment where they're attacking a city and justifying what they're doing. They make this argument that's seen as the kind of first assertion of the realist doctrine, which could be called might makes right, but it's not exact. That's not exactly the argument.
Now, the city of Athens, as you mentioned, is a is an extraordinary city, and in its own way, Sparta is equally extraordinary. They're really types, right? And the Peloponnesian War is endlessly useful as a metaphor or an analogy for any number of modern situations. But tell us a little bit about the Persian War and how it preceded not only preceded the Peloponnesian War, but also helped to define and solidify what those two cities were and what they represented.
Yeah. All right. So the key fact, I'll explain some of the complications in a minute, but the key fact is Athens and Sparta were allies in the Persian War. And so the Persian Wars were two big attempted invasions by the Persian Empire, which was the dominant empire. So the Persian Wars were, let's say, roughly 50 years before the outbreak of the main Peloponnesian War. And that's when but like many wars, they didn't have exactly a clean endpoint. So, but Athens and Sparta, and all of the Greek city-states allied together because Persia was essentially trying to envelop Greece into its empire. And so there were these two big waves where Persia thought it could just crush Athens as it had crushed many other places. And so there was an alliance. So all of the Greek city-states, which weren't politically unified, then banded together. A few of them went over to the Persian side because they were closer to Persia and thought they had to. But most of the Greek city-states banded together in an alliance to fight off the Persians. And that was what kind of brought Athens and Sparta to even greater prominence, because they were together they were the heroes of the Persian Wars. In different, the story of, you mentioned the 300. That's an example. That was part of Sparta fighting off the Persians as the Persians were coming through the pass in Thermopylae, and then Athens also the Athens even had to vacate the city for a while and take to the seas because it was so it was closer to Persia than Sparta was, and it was easier to for Persia to get there, and so Athens had to flee the city for a while. So, all right, so long story short, they are the two heroes, sort of arm in arm, of the Persian Wars. And then what happened is the aftermath was the story of the gradual crumbling of an alliance and the turn and the slow morphing into animosity. And the main way that happened is that Sparta was actually the alliance was called the Delian League, and Sparta was the head of it for a while, but they had a very corrupt and nasty commander named Pausanias, who the other Greeks hated, and he would and everybody wanted rid of him. And Sparta, which was much more of a kind of isolationist power by its nature, wanted to essentially go back into cocoon Sparta. So Sparta kind of went back home, entrenched, and in that time, Athens stepped up to be the leaders of that alliance and did that initially, you could say, somewhat heroically. But then their leading of that alliance began to slowly morph over time into their imperial domination as their allies got sort of slowly turned into subjects. And so that's the Athenian Empire grew out of the transformation of this Delian League into an age of Athenian dominance. And so the 50 years is what happens in 50 years is the alliance breaks down and Athens gets more and more and more powerful. And Thucydides says that the cause of the Peloponnesian War is that the growth of Athens's power inspired fear in the other cities, especially in the Spartans, and compelled them to go to war. So he gives this ambiguous statement. In a sense, you could say he says the Spartans started it, but they were driven to do it by the growth of Athenian domination and the prospect that Athens would eventually engulf them too.
It's interesting how Thucydides attempts to be really objective about this and other things.
Yeah.
He's not writing a war about how the Athenians are so great, and
Right.
he's literally a general fighting on the for the Athenians, but he is presenting
Absolutely
the case for their enemies
Yeah.
just as forcefully as his own case.
Yeah, it's absolutely not just Athenian advocacy, and it's very ambiguous which of the two sides he thinks is superior. And he actually ended up he was a great writer. He wasn't such a great general. He makes a key blunder in the middle of the war, and the Athenians exiled him. And so he actually went to Sparta for the last part of the war, not to do anything political, but he wrote much of the work outside of Athens after he'd been exiled.
So the war starts over a more regional conflict between the Corinthians and the Cyclopedian. What are they called?
The Corcyraeans.
Corcyraeans. That's
Yeah.
right. And one Corinth is aligned with Sparta,
Yes.
and the other is aligned with Athens, and so they kind of draw in the two
Yes.
major powers.
Exactly. So it's like many wars where the main powers are kind of sucked in by smaller powers. It's a very complicated situation, but the short version would be Corinth and Corcyra were at odds with each other. And Corcyra was this small place way up to the northwest. But they had a fairly significant navy, as did Corinth. So the most powerful navy in all of Greece was Athens. Number two was Corinth. Number three was probably this place, Corcyra. And Corinth was about to crush Corcyra. So Corcyra came to Athens and said, you don't want our navy falling in the hands of your enemies, because there's always a lot of tensions between Corinth and Athens. And they basically said, here's the situation, Athens. A broader war is coming. It's on the horizon. You know that. And you don't want our navy to fall into the wrong hands. You rather strengthen your hand than weaken your hand. So Athens had to make this very difficult decision. Do they do what the Corcyraeans were urging, strengthen their hand because a broader war is coming? Or do they hold back in the hope that they can stave off a broader war if they act less aggressively, which is what Corinth told them to do. They said, we can avoid a broader war, stay out of this, it's not your business, stay out. Athens ultimately decides, more or less, to side with Corcyra. That is kind of the last straw for Corinth. And so Corinth calls a big conference in Sparta together with other cities, and they go to Sparta and they make the case, look, Sparta, this is what Athens is doing. You know, Athens is not going to stop. It's time. And they're actually quite angry with the Spartans for being so passive as Athens was getting so strong. So they make the case to Spartans, you know, it's getting, the hour's getting very late to resist Athens. So that episode was kind of the trigger that sparked the broader war.
And these arguments that you're describing, that these various powers are making to either Athens or Sparta, these are all depicted as speeches in the narrative and are magnificent Shakespearean kind of speeches. And each one, at least to me, is so persuasive that you're totally convinced by the first, and then you're totally convinced by the second.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the wonderful things about Thucydides' book. It makes it so much more than just a sort of typical step-by-step chronological history. That about, I don't know, a quarter of the book is actually speeches that Thucydides has reconstructed. And he says that, you know, sometimes it's closer to probably what it was exactly said. Sometimes it's Thucydides kind of massaging it and filling it in himself, what he thinks was likely to be said. But the speeches make it so much more gripping to read than a typical history of ancient events. And they really draw you in, and you have to pass judgment. So for instance, when I'm teaching it, I ask the students to imagine that they were Athenians listening to the speech of the Corcyraeans and the Corinthians. And then I asked them which side they would have voted. You know, how would you have voted? Mm-hmm. I try to get some debate going between the different sides.
That's great. So how long was this war?
27 years. Now, although there was a gap in the middle, I don't know what 6-ish, give or take, years in the middle, where they had a truce, a peace. And so Thucydides says that many people regard it as two separate wars. But he says that he regards it as one long continuous war, because that peace was really only a peace in name, and it was just a kind of like halftime. You know, they knew that it was gonna that it was gonna resume, and they were jockeying for power, and it wasn't a genuine. Everybody knew that it wasn't, or it came to know rather quickly that it wasn't going to be a lasting peace.
So how old was he when it started?
How old was Thucydides? I'm not entirely sure. I imagine he probably would have been 30 or 40. So he was an Athenian. He was a wealthy Athenian. His family owned gold mines up in the region around Thrace. So he was stationed up there as a general. And he says at the beginning of the book, though, that he saw as the forces were aligning at the beginning of the war, he says, I knew this was going to be a massive war. I knew this was going to be one of the greatest, so he says, motions or movements of history. And so I decided to write, and he spent much of his wealth on messengers to bring him information from the war and reports. So he spent much of his money getting information funneled to him so he could write the book. And it's the only thing he ever wrote. So it's a very strange thing, this masterpiece that he spent the whole war writing. And there's some dispute about whether the last book is finished or not. So.
Also during this time, especially as the war is beginning, you have many legendary figures on both sides of the war, but among them in Athens are two world historical figures, Socrates and Pericles.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the most striking thing about Thucydides' book when it comes to Socrates is he doesn't mention it. Mm-hmm. So there's this Socrates was one of the central figures, obviously, it was a time of immense intellectual flourishing, a real peak of philosophy in Athens at the time, and nobody was more central to that than Socrates. And Socrates knew personally and shaped some of the figures in the war. For instance, the most striking example is a young general named Alcibiades, who became very infamous because he became a traitor later. And actually, part of the reason Socrates was later accused of corrupting the young was because he had educated this, or at least had a big influence on this young guy, Alcibiades. But Socrates, surprisingly, plays no role in Thucydides' history. It's a strange fact. But Pericles is huge. I mean, Pericles was the great leader of Athens going into the war. So Pericles had been the figure for the years prior to the war who had been at the forefront of building up Athens into this incredible power. And he was Thucydides says that during the time of Pericles' domination, Athens was a democracy in name, but in fact, in a sense, ruled by the one best person. So Pericles was the dominant figure, and he was urging Athens Athens was divided, as most places are in times of war, into hawks and doves, and he was the kind of leading hawk, urging Athens into the war and setting the strategy. And here's if you guys like historical counterfactuals. One of the striking things about the war is Pericles died very early on. People think it was from the plague, which hit Athens very shortly after the war broke out. And so Pericles had this war plan, and had Pericles lived and not died prematurely, things might have gone very different. And in fact, you could spin it out. Much of world history could have been very different, because it's very likely that Athens could have won the war if Pericles had been at the helm all along and hadn't died earlier, because the subsequent leaders were not cut from the same cloth as Pericles. And Athens makes an enormous blunder at the end of the war that causes their downfall, or contributes mightily to their downfall. But their blunder, which is something called the Sicilian expedition, when they decided to try to invade and take over Sicily, Pericles, as part of his original war plan, had said no new acquisitions till this war is over. In other words, no imperial expansion until this war is over. So Pericles might have, again, this is counterfactuals or speculative, but Pericles might have kept the Athenians from doing that. And had Athens not done that, it's highly likely that Athens would have won the war. And then what? Because Athens was a mighty empire. And so unlike Sparta, Athens could have been a very powerful empire for a very long time, potentially. And so world history could have been very different had Pericles not died of the plague.
He just wore his mask.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Pericles and may have contributed to the likelihood of his own death, right, by his Periclean strategy, which led to, or at least exacerbated severely, the plague itself. And can you tell us a little bit about that strategy?
Yeah. So the background is this: Sparta's great strength was on land, and Athens' great strength was on the sea. So that was the basic dynamic of the war. And Pericles' war plan was, he said, we're going to come inside the city's wall. So Athens was a walled city, but it also had a countryside around the walls. And even like today, the countryside tended to be somewhat more old-fashioned, somewhat more conservative, somewhat more almost Spartan-like. And then the more urban was the sort of urban, modern, progressive center was in the city. And so he said, here's our war plan. We can't fight Sparta on land. So they're going to invade Attica, the region around Athens. They're going to invade by land. That's what they'll obviously do. But instead of fighting them there, we'll come inside the city and we'll take to the seas, and we'll go down to the harbor and we'll fight the war on the sea. It makes a ton of sense as a military strategy, but it meant having to crowd all of the Athenians within the city. And I think this is what you're referring to. This is what made the plague so deadly, because they were having to overpopulate, jam everybody into the city to make this work, because they had essentially ceded the the rural areas and brought everybody in. And had that not been the case, the plague would have still come, but it would have been much milder. And so that's part of what made the plague such a disaster for Athens. Yep.
There were two blunders that were mentioned, and I wanted to clarify who was sort of at the helm of these blunders. You'd mentioned that Thucydides made a blunder. I don't think.
Yeah, so Thucydides' blunder was a relatively minor blunder. So late in the war, or not late, middle of the war, there's this very striking figure who emerges in Sparta. His name is Brasidas, he's unlike the other Spartans. He's very bold and aggressive and daring. And he hatches this plan of going on a kind of liberation mission up to northern Greece and up to this Thracian region, where there were all of these small cities that were along the coast, but Sparta could get there by land, that were Athenian subjects. And he had this plan: let's go to all those cities and let's pick them off from the Athenian Empire and free them, and sort of make Athens. He perceived that Athens's weakness was trying to keep its subjects under its control while it was in a bigger war. And if these cities revolted, that was a terrible problem for Athens. So he went up and initiated a whole wave of revolts. Thucydides happened to be stationed in one of those cities and was trying to get a fleet there to fight off Brasidas, and he didn't get it there in time. So he got the fleet too late to say. He was a general / admiral at the time, trying to bring a fleet up to defend a city, was too slow in showing up, and so lost the city. And that's what got Thucydides. So, but in the bigger picture of the war, that was a mistake, but not a huge mistake.
Right.
The huge mistake that Athens made was, as the sort of Cold War-ish peace in the middle was breaking down and the war was resuming, instead of saying, all right, now we really need to win this war in Greece, Athens hatched this plan: let's go conquer Sicily and become so powerful that it'll just be a fait accompli for Sparta. The goose will be cooked, because we'll have engulfed Sicily. We'll essentially, let's go big, go way over there, take over Sicily, and then we're just going to be too massive an empire. So it was a very bold Athenian move. And that is the main thing that caused Athens's downfall. So that what ended up being, they almost got it. It wasn't a crazy idea. They very nearly got it. And there's another historical what if you could play with that, because their leading commander, whose brainchild this idea was this guy named Alcibiades, this young, vigorous, bold leader. But he had been charged with some sacrilegious acts in Athens, and he had some real opponents at home. So while he was over there, he was called back to stand trial, and he thought he would probably be convicted and maybe even killed if he went back to Athens. So he fled, and he ended up even going to Sparta. And in an act of, a world historical act of traitorism, he spilled all the beans to Sparta about Athens's plan and told Sparta, get over there very fast, or Athens is going to succeed, and then you're cooked. And so so the historical what if is, well, what if Alcibiades hadn't been recalled to Athens? If he had remained the commander of that mission? All these historical what ifs, you don't know, but it's very likely that it would have succeeded. And then what then? Then Athens would have been a massive empire and likely would have won the war that way.
One of my favorite moments from Thucydides is the funeral oration of Pericles.
Yeah.
The plague is going on. People are angry at Pericles. So he's speaking to honor the dead who have just lost this fight, or been killed in a fight at any rate, and to commemorate them. But he's also making a political speech, both in favor of himself and a defense of himself, but also a larger statement of the value of Athens to the world. Mm-hmm. the distinguishing characteristics that makes Athens such an extraordinary place that he was obviously very conscious of this. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is probably the most striking speech maybe in the whole work. And again, you're right. It comes early in the war as he's trying to rally Athens to the cause of the war. So it is to honor the dead, but he's clearly speaking to the living, trying to inspire them to be devoted to the cause. And his case sort of has several points. One is he describes Athens as a very unique city. The subtext is it's worth risking your life for this place. But he describes how it's so much freer and so much more cosmopolitan than its rivals, i.e., especially Sparta. It's so he said, we're the most beautiful city the world has ever seen. We're the freest. We're the openest. We don't beat virtue into people the way the Spartans do. We elicit it by giving it grand opportunities. And so that's part of it. Then he calls for the citizens to sort of fall in love with this beautiful, powerful city. And then he also promises them glory as the reward for devoting themselves to this war cause. So it's kind of the ultimate expression of the outlook that in a way the best thing in life is to be devoted to a grand, glorious city, especially in a time of war. And it's got, you could say, both the power and the problems of that kind of appeal.
Well, it's fascinating too because it comes shortly in the narrative after another speech by an opponent of Athens who is describing how they're a cruel empire, that they've gone too big for their britches, and they push people around and they exploit people and so forth. And then Pericles shortly afterwards makes the speech talking about why Athens is so free, why it's so productive, why it's such a site of genius. And it really, I find it impossible as a modern reader not to hear the two views of the U.S.
Yeah, and also, I think the book also probably read a little differently during the Cold War. So, you said that sometimes people see that divide, and so I think a lot of people during the Cold War sort of saw it as Sparta is kind of like the Soviet Union in some respects, and Athens is like the United States. Yeah, I mean, and and it's like the U.S. in the sense that it's powerful, it's big, it's free, and it's bold, and it has its critics. So in all of those respects, yeah. I mean, the U.S. isn't, Athens was an empire in the much more literal sense of the term, so it's different in that regard. But yeah, there's a lot of the same.
Can you tell us a little more about Sparta? What made it such a special city? It really was a very extraordinary place, also.
Yeah, so Sparta. I'll give you the good thing and then the ugly underside of it. The good thing is that Sparta, many years, and this point is it's unclear how much of this is literally true and how much of it is mythical. So this is something that historians don't know exactly what's true and what's myth. So about 400 or so years before, way back before the Peloponnesian War, Sparta had a lawgiver named Lycurgus, who took what was a typically messy, small, crumbling, conflict-filled city-state and reformed it and gave it these very unusual laws. So that what we typically think of as the Spartan ways of intense communal devotion, rigorous training from youth, rejection of wealth, celebration of communal devotion and martial valor, those stem from Lycurgus. Now, how much that is literally true, it's due to that one man, that's disputed, but it certainly had this very distinctive law code. And the Spartans were committed to this, and they were, in this sense, they were much more deeply law-abiding than the Athenians, and law and piety meant much more in Sparta. And so, and when you think of Sparta, the image of the heroism of the Spartans, the 300 soldiers standing in the pass to fight off the Persians and hold them back for at least some time. That's a kind of emblem of that. So that's the beautiful side, and Thucydides brings that out, and he withholds a key fact I mean, till late in the book, and at a key moment he discloses it, which is a big part of the reason Sparta was that way, is they had the most massive slave population in Greece, and they had to be so disciplined and so fierce because they had this huge slave population, the helots, who they were holding down in a very oppressive way, and they were real enemies. And Sparta lived in fear of a slave rebellion. And that's one reason why Sparta was not expansionist and going out in the world in the way Athens did. It couldn't afford to. It had to stay home. It's one reason why it was isolationist. So it had to stay home and keep a watch over keep a tight grip on its slave population. So, and it's like all these things. The truth includes, I would say, the impressive aspects and that, so both of those, both are true.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know that about Sparta.
Yeah. So yeah, the Helots were I mean, many of these Greek cities, all of them more or less, this one had slave populations. But in Sparta, it was much more brutal, it was bigger, and it was one specific group. So many times in Greece, it would just be whatever people you had beaten in certain battles or something like that. I mean, most slaves were you'd beaten them in war, and so that was that. Where here, I mean, that was the origin of this, but it was a very specific group that Sparta dominated, and they were quite brutal to them. Thucydides tells one story where they were getting rebellious, and Sparta was getting worried, so it hatched this plan saying, any of the helots who are bold enough to come and claim your freedom will give it to you. Mm-hmm. And so the 3,000 stepped up and said, all right, I'd like my freedom. And Thucydides says those people were never heard from again.
Jeez.
So he makes it clear Sparta just slaughtered them.
It's extraordinary. Yeah. The comparison with Athens continues to be so profound, right? The Athenian is free, and yet the Athenian is also independent. The Athenian is wealthy, free thinking, not necessarily, his life is not revolved around Athens. That's why Pericles has to make this appeal, said, listen, your life should revolve around Athens. Right. But in Sparta, you would never have to make a speech like that. The people's lives were so completely dominated by the fact that they were Spartans in every way. That they, for example, if you got married, you continued to live in barracks with the other men. Right, and you ate your meals with the men, common meals. Meals that you would literally sneak out to see your family. Yeah. And could be disciplined for it. And if you were a child, you were forced to essentially spend some time living almost like an animal in the wild. Yep. And things like that. I mean, as you say, it's all based on this need to stay razor sharp at all times. Yeah. So that you're not overthrown. Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the Sparta in some ways is also a kind of democratic experiment, isn't it? I mean, it's democratic in a sense. I mean, they had a complicated hierarchical structure of sorts, but they also had a certain egalitarianism among the Spartans themselves. I mean, obviously the slaves are a different story, but so but the women had equal rights. They had a lot more rights than, for example, Athenian women who were literally not allowed to leave the house. So they're two. I mean, they're two very, very different early political experiments, you could say. One in a kind of radical collectivism and militaristic collectivism. The other in much greater freedom than was at all typical of that time, and much greater individualism. And that's part of what Pericles in that oration you were talking about is praising, the Athenian way. And Pericles' great claim is we can be every bit as virtuous and courageous as the Spartans are, but we don't need to grind it into our citizens. We can elicit it rather than we don't need the whips and chains and the drill sergeants. We can inspire it rather than beating it into our citizens. So the Athenians do ultimately attempt their expedition to Sicily. They almost succeed, but they fail. They're driven back.
Yeah.
Athens loses the war. And as you said, with you refer to the counterfactual, it was a near run thing that could have gone either way, especially if Pericles, for example, had not died. And we might have seen a Hellenization of the world by the Athenians.
Yes.
But instead, we see the Hellenization of the world by someone else. What happens after the war?
Well, after the war, it's kind of a mess. So, I mean, Sparta was dominant for a time, but Sparta was not good at broad leadership outside of Sparta. So Sparta quickly became resented, and Greece fell into sort of more petty level squabbling and infighting. And the period of Spartan dominance after the war was a kind of ugly period. Athens was in decline. It was, not the peak of Greece, and then that enabled the Macedonian Empire to rise and sort of step into the power vacuum. And you're absolutely right. So, and this is the interesting counterfactual. Had Athens won, you would have had this Hellenization or Athensification, I suppose, because it really would have been Athenian dominance. What then? Had it been lasting, it could have been Rome before Rome. And if there was Rome before Rome, would there not have been Rome? Or, so those kinds of things. But so there wasn't, it was Philip and then Alexander who eventually stepped into the breach, and then much later, Rome comes in.
Well,
But there was no longer Athens was never, it's
never
never,
a great political
yeah,
power.
never a great political power again.
But Philip, of course, rises up in Macedonia. Or Macedon. He becomes very powerful. He is a very innovative military leader. He comes down and conquers Greece, conquers Athens, and then is assassinated. And his son decides to conquer the Persian Empire, which no Greek had ever even remotely considered. Their ambitions had never gone beyond resisting Persian invasion, right? And so what Alexander is attempting is insane. But it's an interesting question. Obviously, Alexander, needless to say, goes on not only to conquer the Persian Empire, but to conquer the world, the known world, as far as India. Right. But the question is, didn't Athens kind of conquer the world in a way too, just because Alexander's disposition towards Athens was such that he took his legitimacy, to a large extent, from his Greekness?
Yeah, yeah, sort of. Yeah, and he was a pupil in some respects of Aristotle.
Yes.
Yeah, so he was an ambiguous figure. Yeah, I mean, he was
the Iliad under his pillow.
Yeah, so he was certainly influenced by Greek civilization, but I don't think his empire was the same kind of thing that you would have had there been a vast Athenian empire, which there was, but only for, you could say, historically speaking, for a moment.
Right.
In historical terms, the Athenian Empire had its day, and it quickly faded. So yeah, I think the world would have been quite different had Athens won the war. But you can spin out those what ifs and fill in the blanks yourself. But I think it's especially interesting to think, could it have possibly had differences? Things have gone different in the West, such that Rome might have never become what it was if there had been a vast Greek empire there.
Now, what do you think is the legacy of the Peloponnesian War and of Athens and Sparta today?
Well, I think, Athens's legacy is largely through other things, like what you mentioned. You mentioned Socrates earlier, and the great intellectual flourishing. I sort of think that the classical period of Athens was one of the great intellectual flourishings of human history, and that left a legacy. And so that had life, and it created philosophic movements that then continued out and that made their way into Rome in various different ways eventually. And are still studied. In fact, that's primarily what I study. I primarily study the philosophy, not the history. So Greek philosophy lives on and has shaped the world ever since in various different ways. Politically, it seems to me it's one of the sort of politically it's on the one hand one of the great wars of human history that people look back to as one of the first kind of quasi mini world wars of a sense, within a small meaning of the word world there, but kind of a miniature world war, and that has a lot of similarities with later conflicts like the Cold War in certain respects, like World War II in certain respects, like World War I in certain respects. So, and I think people still study it for military lessons. But in terms of its impact on the world, it seems to me it's almost like history's great what if. Because the great power was Athens and it lost. So, and that kind of spelled the end of that moment of Greek civilization. So it seems to me that its legacy is more of a kind of vector that would have changed the world had it succeeded, but it was thwarted.
We're talking about military, and I'm wondering what what was the technology at the time? When we talk about the Athenians having the navy, Spartans being infantry, what would it be like? What would a battle? I mean, there's no horses, right?
Well, there were horses. Yeah, there were horses. Yeah,
so there is cavalry.
Yeah, there was cavalry.
Okay.
Yeah,
and
there were
spears.
Yeah, there's spears. So there's basically two main forms of warfare. There's a hoplite warfare on land, where you had these heavily armed foot soldiers with enormous heavy shields bashing into each other and fighting mostly with spears, spears and heavy shields.
Yeah.
And then you had naval warfare. And naval warfare was the, so to speak, technologically advanced warfare of the time. And that was actually one reason that Athens had an edge there. So Sparta's strength was on land, Athens was on the sea. And you could characterize that in some respects as a technological difference, because Athens was better at shipbuilding, and it was also better at the art of. So the land fighting wasn't especially artful. It was essentially large bodies of men clashing into other large bodies. But the naval battles were intricate and difficult and required very skillful maneuvering. And Athens was especially good at that. And so that was Athens' strength. They were better at the shipbuilding. They had better admirals on the sea. And what they would try to do is just to box the ships into very awkward positions and lock them up. And, so it wasn't a given that the side with more ships would necessarily win.
So even though you're saying, the Spartans were better on land, they had to have the ships to get to where they're going.
Well, not in this case, because Athens and Sparta were actually connected by land. So it's all part of the same land. So Sparta is on a peninsula of sorts that sticks out, but there's a land bridge that goes from the Peloponnesian Peninsula into the main part of Greece where Athens is. So they just marched in. They just marched in by that.
Right?
Yeah. Well, eventually, I mean, although if Athens had not gone off to Sicily. Yeah.
I'm just trying to imagine, if you don't have to fight in the sea, then what good is the navy?
Well, the Athenians were able. Correct me if I'm wrong. But they would go to the Peloponnese and attack cities on the coast.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So they would harass them.
Yeah.
So I'll give two examples of that. One is they set up a little base right near the Spartan coast, which they were trying to set up a kind of center for the slave revolt. So say give the Spartan slaves a place to rally to, and so they could harass them along the coast, and then they could just build up their power by taking over islands and places that were reachable by sea. So essentially, Pericles' original war plan wasn't exactly, we're going to go crush Sparta. It was, we're going to outlast Sparta by dominating the sea, by controlling the sea, and eventually Sparta is going to become so isolated and exhausted that they can't touch us. We may even never even have to invade them. We just need to get them to stop resisting us. And if we can go to the sea and dominate the sea enough, at a certain point they'll just give up. So he didn't necessarily even envision we'll march on Sparta and burn it down. That wasn't even part of his vision. It was just, if we dominate the sea, they can't stop us. We'll have the empire, and eventually we can peel off their allies.
That makes sense.
Well,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
that's what I was just going to mention about how controlling the seas is important because there's an economic advantage that comes with
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
You can block resources and of course control the flow of resources for yourself and keep them away from Sparta.
And that's is one reason why Athens was far wealthier than Sparta. So this is another one of Pericles' points. He says, our big edges in this war is we're innovative, we're better on the sea, and we're wealthy. And Sparta is poor, bad on the sea, and stuck in the past. And so it's so that was the vision. And Athens was far wealthier than Sparta. Sparta was partly poor by design originally, but that proves to be a problem when a big war comes.
So what would an attack? I'm just trying to imagine because it's cool to imagine, right? It's like, what would an attack from sea look like? I mean, is it like just swarms of arrows coming from a ship?
No,
like,
they would no. So they had these big ships called triremes that they would and sometimes they would fight literally on the sea. So they'd tie up the other ships, hook them, and then there would actually be sort of like land fighting on the ship. So you send hoplites from one ship onto the other ship, which must have been an especially brutal form of fighting. Or sometimes they would use the ships to launch an invasion of a coast. So, for instance, and one of the big moments of the book that leads to one of the most sort of morally explosive parts of the book is where Athens decides to just conquer an island, which was a nominal Spartan ally, and that it's named Milos. It's still there, and Athens just shows up with a whole bunch of ships, says, "We're here. You're our subject now." And they say, "Oh no, we're not. We're going to go get the Spartans will come help us, or the gods will help us." And the Athenians argue, "You're very naive. The Spartans can't get here. The gods don't care. And so you should submit." And they refuse to submit. And then Athens slaughters them. And so this is sort of a low point for Athens in the book. Athens just slaughters the men of the city and enslaves the women and children and takes over the island.
And we're talking about when say I'm a citizen and I'm not a part of the military. Doesn't matter. They just come in and take.
Oh, you mean in Milos? Yeah, if you were an adult male, you'd be toast. Yeah, in that case. Now that wasn't always so brutal. And so the brutality of the war, I mean, it was a very brutal war, but it wasn't uniformly brutal. At some moments it was extremely brutal, and some moments it was much less so. And one of the themes of the book also that Thucydides develops is that the civil conflict, when what he calls stasis, which is his word for civil strife, the most extreme version of which would be full-blown civil war. He says this is the worst of all. That's the most brutal, the harshest form of war. And he gives this remarkably relevant still statement about the brutality and the awfulness of civil war. And this is one of the things where it's remarkable how much of this stuff is still relevant. I mean, Syria, it's there you go, there you have it. And and he says at one point, he says that I've written a possession for all times because the problems I talk about in this book will always recur. It hasn't been proven wrong yet.
Along the same lines is that this strategy of the Athenians to try and wear down Sparta by starving it, by cutting it off, by making life miserable, is a strategy that's been used throughout the history of warfare and really doesn't succeed very often, right? I mean, people don't tend to just decide, you know what, life has become so miserable,
we give up.
that we give up, right? And we tried that in Vietnam, bombing them to the Stone Age, and the Soviets tried that in Afghanistan, and it's like it doesn't work, right? And it didn't work for Athens.
Yeah, there's a moment in the book where, on the Sicilian expedition, the key city in Sicily was Syracuse, and Athens was trying to defeat Syracuse. And had they gotten Syracuse, essentially the rest of the dominoes in Sicily would fall. And they had enveloped Syracuse. They had built walls all around it, and they had blocked off its harbor. And it very nearly worked there, but it didn't in the end. And that was the pivotal moment when Athens finally launches an attack into the Syracusan harbor because the Spartans are coming over to relieve the Syracusans. And it almost, he says, the Syracusans were even deliberating about terms of submission. They were ready, they were themselves debating what are the terms of submission. And so that was the moment where it pivoted. And then the Athenians fail and they get trapped on Sicily and they have to flee inland. And as you can imagine, the Sicilians did not treat them kindly. Yeah. So they end up, this is one of the most remarkable things that Thucydides describes the beginning of the expedition in this very inspiring terms that all the ships are racing each other out to the first mark and everybody's excited and thrilled. And so the expedition begins in this atmosphere of hope and excitement. And then it ends with these Athenians dying of thirst, hunger, and cold in a quarry where the Syracusans just throw them in a big quarry and essentially let them rot to death in there. So
brutal stuff.
Yeah.
Brutal stuff. And we're just about out of time. So I want to ask Lance and William Gold, do you have any further questions for our distinguished guest?
So this book was a life's work, evidently, over at least over the course of almost 30 years, right? That's fascinating stuff. I mean, I guess it would have. What do you know? Was it something he was working on the whole time, or was it something he just put together at the end?
No, he gives the. I don't think it's known exactly, but he certainly gives the impression at the opening of the book that he decided to write it as he saw the war emerging and starting. So even before it started. So he gives the impression, and I have no reason to doubt it, that he worked on it more or less the whole time. Yeah.
Interesting.
Do we know much about him other than what's in his own work?
Not really. So here's an odd thing. You mentioned this relationship between Socrates and Thucydides. And it's weird because there's this world of Greek philosophy and then there's Thucydides. And one would like to know how much interaction there was. And it's not really known.
That's something related to the point that I was going to ask about, which is, do you think there's a political reason why Socrates isn't mentioned in Thucydides' work?
There could be. It could be that Thucydides wants to downplay, perhaps, the importance of philosophy in Athens and maybe even his own involvement in philosophy. That's possible. It seems to me likely that Thucydides was familiar with the people in the more philosophic circles, but those were also quite controversial. And maybe Thucydides wants to downplay that, but that's speculation on my part. It's something of a mystery that nobody quite knows the answer to. Why Thucydides says so little about intellectual life in Athens, by which he must surely have been shaped.
Well, it's also true, isn't that a lot of people say that they think Socrates' ultimate trial and execution was itself an outgrowth of the war, after the war.
Yeah, for two reasons. One is just the general angry, grumpy state of Athens. And there's a couple of complications. One thing that brought Athens down was the Sicilian expedition, and one of the main figures responsible for that, both for urging him to go and for switching sides, was Alcibiades. And then another thing that brought Athens down was a series of coups, essentially, in the wake of the Sicilian expedition. So Athens wasn't fully defeated by the Sicilian expedition, and it might have regrouped, but it started to have internal conflict and coups. And some of the figures involved in those coups were also associated with Socrates. So Socrates himself wasn't involved, but some of the people on whom he had quite an influence were regarded as part of what had brought Athens to its knees.
These long-haired beatniks.
Yeah, exactly.
Making great trouble.
Yeah, and so that was So I think it's very possible that Socrates wouldn't have been executed if it weren't for those connections. So when the crime Socrates is accused of was not believing in the gods of the city and corrupting the young. And the corrupting the young part was not just a general blanket thing. They had some specific people in mind that they thought he had corrupted.
Perhaps including that general.
Yeah, exactly. Alcibiades. Alcibiades was one.
And he's a character in some of the Socratic dialogue.
Yeah, they're in three of them. Yeah, in fact, two of them are named after him. And he was a kind of student of Socrates. Yeah.
Well, I have to admit, unlike this guy, our resident historian LB, I knew nothing about this topic coming in here. So I think you've done a fantastic job.
Oh, good.
Of this. So now that we've done our test, you ready to do the real thing?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. The warm up act. Yeah.
You mean you didn't record?
Yeah.
Wait, I did record. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes, you definitely raised the level of our discourse here on the show, and we are immensely grateful.
Yeah, my pleasure. So yeah, I love talking about it.
Any final thoughts on the war, or anything else to do with this?
No, I mean, if I would say it's we're studying, it's really one of the most fascinating periods of history, I think, and so I've taught Thucydides a number of times, and I love it every time. So my wife and I joked that we should create a TV miniseries out of the Peloponnesian War, and I think yeah. So
one of many historical periods that would make a great HBO series.
Yeah.
It really would. Why has there not been one?
I don't know. There should be. It would.
Excellent.
Yeah, this would be expensive. You'd need fancy ships and big crowds and things like that. But there should be. I mean, yeah. No, there should be. I mean, and it's a long thing with many fascinating and interesting episodes. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you for your excellent listening at home, and we forgive you for your many, many crimes. And that's all we have to say to you. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.